Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I bring warmest greetings from Grenada's Prime Minister, Dr. the Right Honorable Keith Mitchell. Mr. President, Prime Minister Mitchell sincerely believes in the work of the General Assembly and is only absent because he believes that as Chairman of CARICOM, his presence in the region allows his colleague Prime Ministers to travel to New York to plead the cases of their hurricane-stricken countries. Mr. President, our hearts and prayers go out to all of the victims in our Caribbean region, Mexico, and across the world who are presently suffering the adverse effects of climate change and natural disasters. Within the last few weeks, Mr. President, our fellow OECS and Caribbean small states of Barbuda and the Commonwealth of Dominica were ravaged by Hurricanes Irma and Maria, causing near total destruction and the loss of many lives. Mr. President, our hearts also go out to the people of Cuba, with whom our region shares a very special friendship. Mr. President, permit me to implore the international community to recognize without delay our responsibility to assist all those affected by natural disasters. Mr. President, I join those before me in congratulating you, Mr. President, on your election as President of this august international body. I am confident in your stewardship and assure you, Mr. President, of my delegation's cooperation and support. Mr. President, I also take this opportunity to commend your predecessor, Ambassador Peter Thompson of Fiji, for his able stewardship of the 71st General Assembly. I also wish to thank both you and Secretary General Guterres for your leadership and willingness to serve as guardians of the spirit of our UN Charter, Mr. President. I believe there is value in repeating your astute and entirely relevant observation that the United Nations Charter makes only 5 references to war, while peace was referenced 47 times. Mr. President, over the next few minutes, I will endeavor to offer Grenada's interpretation of what is meant by to strive for peace and a decent life for all on a sustainable planet. This is the theme, Mr. President. Mr. President, allow me to say a few words on climate change. I am sure that almost every speaker here mentioned something about climate change. And this is because, Mr. President, as we all know, is a very relevant and topical subject. Certainly based on recent activities in the Atlantic, we just cannot dispute that the climate is changing, Mr. President. In fact, 97% of actively publishing climate scientists agree that climate change is due to human activities. Mr. President, for those that question the veracity of this science, the cluster of extreme weather events over the last few years ought to suffice in sounding the alarm. Mr. President, extreme weather events disproportionately affect our planet's most vulnerable, such as women, children, and the elderly. Grenada therefore advocates for special attention to be given to that group. As we assess the physical damage caused by these disasters, Mr. President, let us never forget the psychological toll it has on survivors. Mr. President, we reiterate Grenada's commitment to the Paris Agreement. Speaking in his capacity as chair of the World Bank Small States Forum in June of this year, Grenada Prime Minister lamented the withdrawal of key partners from this agreement, and we therefore encourage them, Mr. President, to reconsider. Mr. President, the government of Grenada has adopted an ambitious blue growth agenda to take advantage of our vast maritime territory and its countless resources. Grenada aims to be the beacon of sustainable development for maritime states around the world. Our relatively small size makes this an interesting and achievable project, Mr. President. Our Blue Growth Master Plan offers many opportunities for collaboration. Mr. President, the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, has emphasized the need to advance measures to develop sustainable ocean-based economies in the Caribbean. The word Caribbean reminds us of beautiful beaches, Mr. President, like the world-famous Grenada Beach in Grenada. Our recent endeavors aim to use our maritime waters, Mr. President, in a sustainable manner governed by robust policies in our people's interests. Mr. President, I previously alluded to the many variables that influence the sustainability of our planet. Small states like Grenada and other CARICOM countries have to battle to keep our access to finance markets. Mr. President, in March of this year, the IMF published a report titled Recent Trends in Correspondent Banking Relationship, the CBRS, which highlights some of the challenges facing financial institutions and government of small states. Realizing that the number of CBRs has decreased, the IMF anticipates a negative effect on global trade and economy this year. Furthermore, in the case of Grenada and the rest of CARICOM, the high cost of compliance with the international tax agenda was underscored at the 9th General Meeting between the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, and the United Nations systems. Mr. President, added to the threat of loss of correspondent banking relationship, we also have to deal with the unilateral and often unfounded blacklisting of our institutions as money launderers and tax havens. Mr. President, Grenada has worked tirelessly to sign tax information exchanges agreement and has signed 14 such agreements since 2010. Mr. President, as policymakers, it pains us when we expend our limited resources to comply with rules only to face unjust consequences when we are quite evidently in compliance. Mr. President, there are no easy answers to these challenges, but I urge our partners to desist from draconian approaches to these matters when dealing with vulnerable, small developing states as ours. Mr. President, Grenada also supports the General Assembly Resolution 70/5, which calls for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba. We also believe that renewed dialogue may augur well for the discovery of a mutually acceptable solution for both parties. Finally, on finance, Mr. President, I am proud to report that Grenada's structural adjustment program has been highly commended locally, regionally, and internationally. In May of this year, the IMF reported that Grenada, and I quote, Grenada has continued with steadfast implementation of reforms and made progress towards achieving the key program goals. Mr. President, through the wisdom and leadership of our Prime Minister and the sacrifices of the Grenadian people, Mr. President, Grenada's economy is today on solid footing. Grenada's thriving economy today is proof that the word structural adjustment are not inherently bad. Mr. President, investments, both foreign and local, is at its highest levels in recent years. However, Mr. President, we are cautious to declare victory, though we are very confident that we are headed in the right direction. Mr. President, Grenada believes that all 7 billion of the planet's humans are entitled to certain fundamental human rights. Mr. President, the UN Declaration on Human Rights 1948 is unambiguous. And we should all be guided by Article 1 of the Declaration, which states that all humans are born free and equal. Mr. President, on the issue of international security, Grenada continues to work with our international partners in the interest of world peace. Mr. President, Grenada is active and compliant on numerous matters of international security. Grenada views the situation on the Korean Peninsula with great trepidation and do hope that this potential conflict will be resolved peacefully. Mr. President, the proliferation of nuclear weapons is inherently destructive and serves no useful purpose for humanity. Grenada therefore urges its friends and allies to desist from all development and testing of these weapons. Mr. President, 105 billion US dollars are spent each year on development of nuclear weapons. This amounts, Mr. President, to some $12 million per hour. And Mr. President, if we are willing to make the shift from destruction to construction, the people of Bermuda, Dominica, Cuba, Mexico, and other countries that just recently suffered disaster will be forever grateful to the world. Mr. President, Grenada remains concerned by recent political and social development in Venezuela. In his capacity as chair of CARICOM, Grenada's Prime Minister has offered CARICOM's help in facilitation of dialogue between the government and the opposition in Venezuela. Necessarily, CARICOM's approach must be impartial, Mr. President. CARICOM will not attempt to dictate terms to either side. What we seek is to encourage meaningful dialogue on the premise that the Venezuelan people can come together to safeguard the future of all of Venezuela. In the meantime, we believe, Mr. President, in the art of diplomacy and the principle of respect for sovereignty. Mr. President, in the area of health, this marks the 10th anniversary of the signing of the landmark CARICOM Heads of Government Port of Spain Declaration on Non-Communicable Diseases, NCDs. And while some progress has been made in reducing NCDs, there is still much work left to be done, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Caribbean region has the highest burden of non-communicable disease in the Americas. We therefore urge key allies to continue to partner with us as we attempt to correct this unfortunate reality. Mr. President, Grenada has made important progress in controlling the spread of HIV and AIDS. Only 0.3% of our population presently lives with the disease. The work of Grenada's National Infectious Disease Control Unit and our healthcare practitioners and policymakers must be highly commended for their work in this regard. That work, however, Mr. President, is greatly supported by international assistance that is being depleted without foreseeable replenishment, as it already has in some Caribbean countries. Mr. President, Grenada thanked the Global Fund, the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PAHO, and the German Development Bank for their assistance. I urge donors to be flexible in their relief responses. We cannot wait on data while our people suffer. Mr. President, the data will come eventually, but in the meantime, lives and families and communities are at stake. Mr. President, I close with the assurance that Grenada believes in the UN system. I have had the honor, Mr. President, of representing the people of Grenada, Carriacou, and Pidimanic on several occasions at this very noble and august institution, the UN. As I retire from active political life, Mr. President, I am very optimistic that the window is still open for us to live a peaceful, habitable, and prosperous life for future generations. Mr. President, the challenges of our time are dynamic and continuous, and we would be remiss to put anything first but our planet. I thank you very much, Mr. President.